William?
Sorry, we're a little bit late.
No worries.
But we're on time.
Yes, you are. Yeah, totally. Hi.
Oh, welcome to the IRMACS Centre. My name is Veselin Jungic and I'm a Deputy Director here. Today we are starting a new series, SFU Research Masterclass. The main idea of the series is to have a group of prominent SFU researchers that will, instead of an academic lecture on their research topic, tell the story of their research path and the best practices. So I would like to invite Professor John Pierce, Dean of the Faculty of Environment, to introduce our today's speaker.
Well, it's a real delight to be here. I don't think I need that. Oh, you're recording it. Okay. I need it. Okay. So it is a genuine pleasure to be here. George and I have known each other for many years. Our paths have crossed in many different ways. I got to know George in Kamloops when he was the founding director of SFU's Indigenous Archaeology program from 1991 to 2005. And he worked closely with the Secwepemc and other First Nations in the interior of British Columbia and elsewhere in British Columbia. I think it was 2005 that you then came to Burnaby.
That's right.
And it's just been one success after another for George, which I will say something about in a moment here. In terms of George's research focus, they include Indigenous peoples and archaeology, intellectual property, issues relating to archaeology, the archaeology and human ecology of wetlands, and archaeological theory, all of which he has published extensively in these areas. His most recent book is titled Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeologists, and this is an edited volume that represents the life stories of 37 Indigenous archaeologists from around the world. He's also a series co-editor of the World Archaeological Congress's Research Handbook in Archaeology and former editor of the Canadian Journal of Archaeology. George is also the director of a very ambitious and very important research program. The acronym is IPINCH, which stands for Intellectual Property Issues in Cultural Heritage. And this is a 7-year initiative funded by SSHRC. I think it's an MCRI, is it not? And you're in your 6th year?
That's correct.
And yeah, that renewal just went through last year, correct? If any of you have ever been involved in a short-based MCRI, you will know how much work, how much bureaucracy is involved here. But what is more significant and more important here with respect to this program is that it's an international program. It isn't just focused on these issues, cultural, intellectual property issues in the case of Canada. But it's truly international with over 50 scholars and 25 partnering organizations concerned with the theoretical, ethical, and practical implications of commodification, appropriation, and other flows of knowledge about the past, and how these may affect communities, researchers, and other stakeholders. And to give you the significance and the importance of what George has done here, and how unique his contributions have been with respect to this, is that just last year, for 2013, George received the first partnership award from SSHRC, and this is, if you're able to understand the degree of competition within Canada, first of all at SSHRC, and then with respect to these other large-scale research projects. This is a tremendous accolade for George and his colleagues, and he's provided enormous intellectual leadership here. And my feeling is that at the end of the 7 years, this is going to continue in one form or another. And that's what one of the purposes of these MCRI grants is to kickstart a very large international initiative. But the acknowledgement with this partnership award, which also came with a $50,000 Shirk prize, is really phenomenal. Now, if that wasn't enough, George has one other feather in his cap, and I just learned about this. It was confirmed today, but I learned about this through the grapevine, that George received the Excellence in Teaching Award from SFU for 2004. And let me just underscore one other aspect to this award, because I sat on this committee. It is an amazingly competitive process. And it's a delight to go through these files to see how seriously people take their teaching. And I think George had been nominated on a number of different occasions. But I really am delighted that he has succeeded in this very important endeavor. So with that, I think we can start.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Pierce. So please welcome Professor Nicholas and Jenna Walsh from the library. That will be the interviewer today.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and welcome, George. It's a great honor to have this opportunity to interview you today and talk about your research story.
Okay.
I wanted to actually start at a place that connects your most recent published work with also the beginning of your, well, maybe not the real beginning of your career, but so in the dedication of being and becoming Indigenous archaeologists, you wrote, "This volume is dedicated to the students in the first class of First Nation students I taught in Kamloops, British Columbia in 1991. They provided me with an education of more value than I can fully acknowledge and opened the door to a new kind of archaeology." Can you share a story that expands on how this shaped your research path and your interest in Indigenous archaeologies?
Thank you. It's been quite the adventure. That I had started out doing traditional archaeology, in fact, focusing on early post-glacial land use, very ecologically oriented archaeology. And then one thing led to another, and I find myself in Kamloops and the opportunity to teach a course in the newly established collaborative program between Simon Fraser University and the Secwepemc Cultural Education Society. And I remember that the first class was in the former residential school. And I walk into what was the former girls' dorm, where SFU, the year before, set up the program. And I sit in the front of the class, and there are 13 Secwepemc students sitting in front of me, including several in the first row with their arms crossed, sunglasses on. And I started into my usual introduction to archaeology class. And literally within 1 minute, I knew that traditional format of lecturing wasn't going to work. So, I just put my notes aside and I began to have a conversation with them to talk about heritage and archaeology and how they saw the land around them and what constituted their heritage. And that one course led to, a full load the next semester, which led to, eventually tenure and the development of the archaeology program there. And over the course of 15 years and thereafter, I found that those years have been so formative in my life in not replacing the other archaeology that I was doing, but adding a whole new chapter to it, a whole new dimension that grounded, these abstract ideas and issues about, well, heritage, but to ground those ideas in people's lives. And, the result was to shift my thinking around and come to appreciate what heritage means to Indigenous peoples in ways that normally you can't get to in any other way in a really deep fashion. So that dedication is just a small acknowledgement of the great debt that I owe to, those 13 students and, to the many community members and others who were so accommodating, of this white guy who was sometimes asking, difficult questions of them, but the questions they were asking of me were far, far more difficult.
So it does sound like a great deal of this also, like that was an introduction to relationship building and building trust and sort of learning to understand the different ways of knowing. And I also, it's often discussed that relationship building is essential to decolonize practice in archaeology and in other disciplines as well. Do you have any sort of tips or methods that you can share that facilitate that kind of like effective and responsible relationship building for research collaborators?
Yeah, I mean, and that points to one of the most important issues that's emerged in cultural heritage and archaeology, certainly the last 30 years, if not longer, and that is the relationship that archaeologists have with descendant communities, whomever they are. It's not always, Native Americans or First Nations or whatever. And too often, these groups have been at loggerheads of not listening to each other, of not understanding the fact that you have this intersection of different value systems, different priorities, and so on. And I think the first lesson that I learned, and this is true of many of my other colleagues who've been so deeply involved with this kind of work, Larry Zimmerman and T.J. Ferguson, Claire Smith, and many, many others. And the first thing is to listen, is to shut up and listen, and to recognize that for much of the conversation that goes on with Indigenous peoples, that they're the experts and not you. And as Larry Zimmerman, my colleague, points out, I mean, the first thing you need to do is humble yourself to recognize that your position is traditionally one of great power and authority. You are the expert, you're the scientist, and yes, that's true at some levels, but the equation changes when you're talking to people about their heritage on their land, and not in the sense that you've got to put your real motives aside, or you've got to defer, or water down, or try to be politically correct. That's not what I'm talking about. It's this notion of recognizing that there is this historic power imbalance, and that some Indigenous peoples, when you're talking to them in a meeting, some elders won't say anything, and you cannot assume that silence means, agreement. Some Indigenous peoples, simply feel, that you are the expert, and so whatever I have to say about my own heritage, isn't as valuable as what you, the expert, have to say. And these have been some really hard-earned lessons. And one case in point is this, that after 10 years or so of working with Indigenous peoples and getting very much involved in what's become known as Indigenous archaeology, I was invited to give a talk at Flinders University in South Australia, and I think this was 2000 or 2001, to talk about my involvement with Indigenous peoples and that whole set of issues. And while I was there, I had the chance to visit a number of archaeological sites and meet with colleagues and so on. And so that was very gratifying, including the opportunity to go to one really important site called Runka Flat that I was looking at in my reconciliation meeting that I was invited to. And so I went there, and there were hundreds of people, of Aboriginal Australians and anthropologists and policymakers and so on. And while I was there, I heard from several people that Richard Hunter is looking for you. And Richard was a tribal elder who happened to be from the land where the one site I mentioned was located, Runka Flat. And I heard this from several people, and so I was thinking, well, maybe Richard has heard about the work I've been doing with Indigenous peoples and, wanted to talk about that. And so we finally connected later that night, and he laid into me, and he said, how dare you go to my traditional land without asking me first? And I was, taken aback. And then I realized, that I made an assumption. And I had assumed that my colleagues who'd been working at that site, including working with Richard, had followed the traditional protocols and asked permission and so on. But that was also my responsibility to have done that. And so that led to a very interesting conversation with Richard later that evening. And there was an immediate reconciliation between us when we finally, sorted all of this out. But that is, I think, a really important, piece of advice, and that is, not to make assumptions. And that goes with working with Indigenous peoples as well as in doing, scientific research. Too often we assume that the stuff that we are reading is, tried and true and a given that we continue to build on. But it never hurts to sometimes go back to those foundational studies and say, well, let's take another look at this. And I think we can all think of examples where someone, looked at earlier work in the sciences or history and realized that, gee, there was a bit missing, or we could now look at this in a completely different way.
So, from what you're saying, it sounds like I sort of want to lead into the idea of also of how communities, how research done in community-based practice, for example, is research done with and for the community. Do you ever find that it's hard to balance your own sort of research interests with those of the community, or sort of how do you approach meeting the two together?
That's a good question. I think all of us need to find, a balance in our various research interests. And, in some cases, if you've made a commitment to working with the community, you really need to avoid the tendency. Sometimes you have no control over this, but there's often the tendency where, a group of archaeologists will work with the community for a particular project, and then they're gone. And they've benefited in the process. They've gained new scientific information. They've published. They get tenure and promotion, all of that. And the community may receive a copy of the report in return, which is often of interest, but sometimes written in technical language. So there's really little balance. So this is something that researchers need to realize, is that they are imposing upon the community, and very often the community is looking to develop relationships, but long-term relations, because as you point out, much of this work involves developing respect and trust in each other, which you cannot do in a single field season. In fact, sometimes it takes several years before the community even allows you into the community to do work there. So that is an important consideration, and not all archaeologists or scientists or whatever, even if they have the desire, don't have the means to make that kind of commitment. Or many universities, although they are encouraging faculty to get more involved in community-based research, which is increasingly common, may not have adjusted their tenure promotion system accordingly, so that the kind of products that may be coming out of a community-based product or project may not be the usual publications that count so heavily for tenure. And it's also kind of research that is potentially very risky for young scholars. If you are developing a project with a community that your thesis or dissertation is dependent on, it's not unknown for a new band council to come on with new priorities, and suddenly the project that was approved by the last band council is now lower down in the priorities, or may even be out the door. So you as a PhD student are suddenly left with, where's my dissertation? Or the same thing with, young scholars seeking tenure. If you cannot publish and if you cannot build up, your CV accordingly through this kind of research, then you may have a hard time getting tenure. So there's a whole host of balances that one needs to, be aware of, and to make decisions accordingly, in whether you work with and for how long a particular community.
That's very helpful, and it sounds like that's yeah, it's an ongoing process within the academy. Um, but so within the community, and you mentioned some of the complications that can arise, but do you have any experiences with capacity building as part of the research process that you'd like to share?
Well, we do, and I think a very good example that I've been involved with was the program we had in Kamloops. That over the course of the 15 years that I was there, and then for several other years until the program closed in 2010, this was the leading institution in Canada, and really one of the very few in all of North America that was explicitly directed to training First Nation students, and not just in the classroom, not just offering basically a full BA degree with several different themes prioritized in terms of linguistics and archaeology and so on, but to offer courses in cultural resource management, in all aspects of field work. And over my tenure there, we probably trained more than 500 First Nation students, many of whom have gone on to careers in archaeology full or part-time. But I think even more important than that, many of those students have ended up on band councils or are certainly voters in their nations, and with a knowledge, firsthand knowledge of archaeology, they are now able to make more informed decisions about their own heritage. Many of our students also went on to education. And so here they are in the classroom, able to develop courses in Secwepemc heritage that's not just the contemporary aspects, but also the pre-contact aspects. So capacity building is something that SFU has certainly had a very long involvement with, and I'd like to just thank John Pierce and all of the others here at SFU who have been so helpful and working so hard over the course of the last 2 decades to really use SFU as a platform to engage in, beyond the slogan of SFU, but to engage in a really meaningful way with First Nations peoples, but also other descendant communities and other stakeholders in British Columbia and elsewhere.
As part of that engagement and relationship, which obviously goes both ways, what can the for lack of a better term, traditional academic world learn from the communities? What can researchers within an academic institution like SFU, whether they're Indigenous or not, learn from those communities? I guess is what I'm asking in an awkward way. Apologize.
No. I mean, I think this is something that resonates with what we've been doing with the iPinch project, which is, a whole story into itself, and it's been the adventure of a lifetime. And as they say, adventures are never fun until they're over. I mean, this has been a lot of fun, but also a lot of challenges. And some of these challenges come back to the point that you brought forward. I mean, what we are really good at doing as academics is theorizing and figuring out how the world works. And sometimes we get it really right. And in other cases, well, we don't know if we've gotten really right. And of course, sometimes we get it really wrong. And it's really not until we take these ideas and go out there in the real world and see how they relate, or see the goodness of fit between theory and practice, or theory and the real world, that we can start to have a fuller understanding of the depth of and nature of the knowledge that we deal with and create or evaluate. And with the iPinch project, I mean, that is something we've had to face full on in just getting this project going, in terms of the assumption that academics are the ones who are best situated to figure out how to develop research projects or what kind of research design works best. It took us 4 years to get the funds from SSHRC for iPinch. They liked it from the start. And they kept encouraging us to apply again and again. And the problem that we finally figured out that they were having is that they didn't like our research methods. They liked this idea of figuring out and theorizing about intellectual property issues and how it affects people and commodification, appropriation, the whole host of things that we're dealing with here. But they didn't like the fact that a significant part of our project was focused on community-based research. And our method with that aspect of the project was basically to put the communities in the driver's seat. That if we're talking about their heritage and the issues that they're having, concerns they're having about, the commodification of rock art images or whatever, is of concern to them, doesn't it make sense to use that as our starting point? And not only to figure out from them, well, what are the issues, but to basically turn over much of the control, if not the whole control of that aspect of that particular project to them. And then to work with them, have some of our academics on the team work with them to develop the research design and to facilitate the whole thing. And in the end, after the project is done, whether it has to do with identifying how the community sees a way to work with human skeletal remains with outside scientists, or a set of protocols for dealing with outside researchers, or developing focus groups to get a better sense of how Yukon First Nations policies over heritage can be comparable to and articulate with those of the provincial or federal governments. Once that research is done, the community reviews the research results to determine what is appropriate or not, and release that to the IPINCH team for our theorizing and so on. So to get back to Shirk, it took us 4 tries to finally convince him that this was the only way that we could conduct this kind of research. And they finally bought it. And the great irony, and this goes back to to this wonderful award we received, the team received last November from Shirk, the Partnership Award. What is so gratifying, and in a sense, what is so ironic, is that we got the award for doing exactly what we said we were going to do from the start. And what this points to is that I think over the last 7, 8 or so years, there's been a change in the academic world, but also at the level of funders to acknowledge the value of this kind of research, whether in the health sciences or beyond. But to acknowledge that there are different kinds of research methods that are needed to achieve the kind of knowledge production that then allows us to theorize until the cows come home. So, I mean, it's been a real challenge, and I know Nancy and John and many others in the Office of Research Services have been well aware of the challenges that we've had with this project, including, Greg Sastis, the university lawyer, has been tearing out our hair about the funding transfers and ethics applications and all these things that we have to go through as part of, the normal business of running university research. And they've gone to, great strides to accommodate this change that has been occurring. So, it's been quite the adventure and a huge learning curve for all of us. And, in all of this, we've been really grateful to the communities for their, patience and I'm sure at times they've just been, amused to tears as to how long it takes us to get our act together to get $24,000 to one of the communities. And in some cases, it's literally taken us 3 or 4 years. And we've got one case study that's still unresolved in the funding. So it's a whole new world out there. And all of the students here, including those in my class but elsewhere, you've got the opportunity now to see how some of these things are coming into being, as opposed to a world where community-based archaeology is simply part of the landscape. I mean, you're watching the growing pains, and I think you have the opportunity to learn much. And at the same time, hopefully to benefit from the process and get involved with this. Because you're going to have your own challenges when you get into your careers, and there are going to be new political or cultural or social issues coming up that require a whole new way of working out some of these issues.
So speaking of the students in the room, and thank you so much for all of your great answers and stories. And I think before we open the room to some questions, I'd actually like to ask you, what's the one thing, or what is one, perhaps of many things, you've learned through experience that you wish you had known as a novice researcher?
Gee, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know if I could really answer it in a really satisfying or clever way. I never thought I'd get to doing the work that I've been doing. Just a series of circumstances led me from doing early post-glacial research to suddenly working with First Nations. In the process, I've learned to be patient. I've learned to listen well. I've learned to be forceful when I need to be, which is not my personality. But I've also tried to be honest in my relations with people, and it comes around. And just to, this is, I think, a good way to close this before questions. I mentioned the conversation I had with the Aboriginal elder Richard Hunter. And, we came to our own reconciliation once we listened to what each other was saying about the circumstance. With the iPinch project, we have been funding case studies all over the world, in Canada, the United States, and Kyrgyzstan, and Japan, and Australia. And our project in Australia is with the Manning River Aboriginal Association. And a year or so into that project, working with colleagues at Flinders University, but also with members of the Manning River Association, including a young woman who's involved in being the director there, Isabel Campbell, I learned that Richard Hunter was her father. And so here was a way where through iPinch, I've been able to work with, but assist the community in ways that I think Richard Hunter would have been so gratified to learn, but which has been to me, just one of those things that the moment you heard it, you get all wobbly inside. So it's just been a really gratifying, opportunity to work with all the folks in the iPinch project, all the community members we have around the world, and all the students who've been involved with the project, but also those in the classroom over the years, because they don't always ask easy questions, and those questions really always force us to, think a little deeper and harder about how we think about the world.
Is there anything else you want to add before I open it, before we go to questions?
No, I think that really covers it.
Okay.
Please use the mic because we record this. I'm trying to run around.
Okay, all right.
Hi, Bill.
I have a couple questions, but I'll start with one anyway. In your experience, how is Canada and SFU matching up with other nations and other universities internationally with regards to the issues that you've talked about today? It's sort of my understanding that Canada is a leader in this regard, but I wonder how they're doing in Australia, how are they doing in New Zealand, and they're dealing with Indigenous peoples and the issues of archaeology you've mentioned today.
Yeah, well, it's certainly in terms, and this is something I noticed years ago, in part due to the nature of treaty negotiations or lack thereof in British Columbia, but also the stronger presence, in a manner of speaking, of First Nations in the province relative to archaeology. BC has been far ahead of everywhere else in Canada in terms of really being proactive about, really being ahead of everyone else in the country. Of course, this is a gross generalization, but that's been my impression. That's really been borne out in many different ways. And that, in terms of facilitating, supporting innovative research, and I say this not just because John is here, my dean, but because it's true, SFU has been one of the leaders in this realm. And you see it in terms of its support for First Nations languages, for many other expressions of trying to address, the real needs of real communities, going beyond simply, following through on what we as a university are supposed to be doing in terms of creating knowledge and so on. I mean, that knowledge doesn't really go very far unless you apply it. So, I think that, both in terms of archaeology first, then SFU, there have been some really impressive strides. Canada is really on par with, some of the best that's coming out of Canada is on par with what's some of the best coming out of New Zealand, Australia, and the United States in terms of innovative cultural heritage policies and working closely with First Nations or Indigenous peoples. Now, in all of these cases, it's not across the board. I mean, not all archaeologists have bought into Indigenous archaeology. Some still see it as political correctness. And I think that also, goes to community-based research in Canada, where you're dealing with, as someone put it, special interests. But I think this is, to be honest, it's just part of the kind of engagement that we as academics or university administrators or funders need to be targeting, and that is, where can we put our money, where can we put our knowledge to the best use for whomever? So, that's sort of a roundabout way of addressing your question.
I'm just wondering if there's ever been a situation in which what you genuinely and professionally thought was the best for a community and they were actively against it. If there was that kind of communication breakdown and what you would do to help that.
In terms of, like...
I'm thinking like, if there's a project where you want... in the back of my head, I'm thinking, as in Canada, a lot of communities that are maybe pro-pipeline or something like that, and that, your professional, what you know to be true or to be good for a community is maybe not what they want, and how do you reconcile what you think is a greater good or something versus...
there have been some... there are many communities doing some really neat, some really, really important work. Stolo First Nations, for example, Kamloops, Musqueam, and others, but they're all dealing with different issues, different priorities. And this is something that I think many of us have been quick to learn in working in the realm of Indigenous archaeology and so on. There's no cookbook solution, that each community has a different history of engagement with the rest of the province or the rest of the country. And in some cases, they've had good relations for a long time. In other cases, it's been very problematic when it comes to the lack of input that the community may have over forestry or development. And in terms of cultural heritage, while First Nations are consulted as part of the legal process, consultation is not the same thing as collaboration. So consultation is, here's the report from the archaeologists in terms of potential impact. Please send us your comments on this within 30 days. Well, those comments may be sent in, what happens? And so this is all really late in the process. So Stolo First Nations, for example, has really taken on control over their own heritage policies. And they are the ones who give permits to those working within Stolo First Nations. In lieu of, or in some cases, a parallel structure to that of the province of BC with the archaeology permits. Your question is a good opportunity to bring forward the idea that First Nations also look at their heritage in different ways. And I found this in Kamloops, that the Kamloops Band and community was really concerned about, really interested in their heritage and preserving it and so on, doing a much better job than the city of Kamloops, as a matter of fact, relating to the loss of the first trading post due to the construction of an arena. And there you've got white heritage basically being lost. But at the same time, the Kamloops community, or sorry, the Kamloops Indian Band put together a huge housing development that ended up destroying 30 significant archaeological sites that I had been working on with our field school students for 15 years. And they did so fully aware of the loss of those sites, but also knowing that they had the archaeological data that we had recovered in part in lieu of preserving those sites. But they had other priorities. So it's one thing to lay this whole area aside to protect from development, but they had to also deal with issues of unemployment, of families dealing with substance abuse, inadequate educational opportunities for their kids. So that's where they needed the funds to bolster their support. And those funds were coming from the lands that were developed for the Sun Rivers housing development. So it was a really, really difficult decision for them. And I highly respect them for that, although I was, it was very difficult to watch that development unfold because I was seeing those sites being destroyed. So communities, First Nations, look at their heritage in different ways. And sometimes it's a physical presence, sometimes it's the knowledge, sometimes it's something else that captures that heritage and preserves it for them.
Thank you.
George, I have a question for you. Taking off on your discussion about community and community priorities and the students that you've worked with, you mentioned that sometimes a student will be working on a project hoping to get a thesis out of the project, and suddenly that project is no longer at the top of the community's priority list. What happens to that student and their thesis? Do they have to reconsider a different project or a different topic?
I mean, this hasn't happened to any of my students, but I know there have been cases, and this is not just in terms of archaeology, but the broader field of anthropology. And if the student has worked closely with their supervisory committee, and those supervisors are aware of the nature of community engagement and so on, there should be a contingency plan. So that one is well aware that this can be risky business. I mean, even in the absence of such, such a plan, and the community has changed its priorities, or one no longer has access to the samples, I think there are always ways to salvage something. And sometimes it's simply a matter of my thesis not about this site, but about the process by which I sought to do this and what unfolded, and what does this tell us at a different level about, more theoretical level, one might say, about how this unfolds. This is a real challenge that I think, universities need to engage with in terms of having discussions, having working groups, so that, those who have been involved with this kind of research, including health science workers in the Lower East End of Vancouver, for example, or would things change? So, we prepared project that for other team members' long-term association with some of these communities. So they're not going into a cold. They're going into it basically in the wake of others who have already established that long and mutually respectful relationship. And this is really what makes that, provides a safety net. And the other side of that point is that how that has come to be is that many of these researchers have been able to and willing to go out on a limb to get involved themselves with some very risky kinds of research over the years. And here I'm talking about like 10, 20, 30 years ago, when such things weren't really being done. And some of my colleagues, like Larry Zimmerman, really paid a price for some of this, and yet he has facilitated, encouraged a whole new, or several generations of younger scholars to follow and learn from what he had done and to build on the kinds of knowledge of protocols and policies that do turn out to be so useful or successful.
Hi, George. How are you?
Hi.
So you had mentioned that it can take sometimes years for one of these communities to kind of have enough trust to let you come in and do research within that community. So I was just wondering if you can give us some pointers on how you develop that trust in a community that might have some distrust of academic researchers.
Well, I mean, in terms of my experiences with that, again, we have seldom gone into a community cold. In some cases, the communities have learned what we were doing and come to us. And an example of that is the Inuit Heritage Trust. They came to ask our advice in developing a comprehensive heritage management plan. Or the same thing with our Ainu partners, Ainu being the indigenous peoples of northern Japan. They became aware of what the iPinch project was trying to do and contacted us to give them advice and help them start to develop their own heritage policies. Since it was only in 2008 the Japanese government officially recognized them as the official indigenous peoples of the country. So they're basically at the bottom level of moving forward. The issues that we've been having, the big holdups with the established relationships that we've had in trying to build our community-based research has been with the practical side of things. And that is, here at SFU, we have to prepare an ethics application for every single project in iPinch because it's under the SFU umbrella. Any associated universities, Indiana University, for example, working with the Saginaw Chippewa, they have to do an ethics review as well, and there has to be an ethics review within the community itself, whatever form that takes. And that can take some time. And there's also, to be frank about it, ethics policies at the universities are really designed to protect the researcher and not and the university, not the communities per se, although there is, of course, protection there. But there was one situation somewhat ironic where a member of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe who was involved with our community-based initiative there and was one of the leaders of that project, she had to take an ethics test at Indiana University to make her qualified to conduct this research on her, with her own people. The other, challenge has been with funding transfers. And I mentioned that, generally we're dealing with about $24,000 to support our various community-based research. And by the way, you can find a lot more about the project on our website. The challenge here is that some of these communities routinely deal with hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of grants. And yet for $24,000, sometimes the paperwork isn't any less, sometimes it's even more. And we had one project all set up, again, with the Saginaw Chippewa tribe. The lead researcher moved universities, and we still have not been able to come up with a viable funding arrangement since that happened. So that project has really been on hold. And the problem here is that the communities have invested so much time in this project, and there's a real value that comes out of these projects. And yet, they have had to wait and wait and wait while we try to switch from a memorandum of agreement between universities to, when that doesn't work, to an agreement for services. When that doesn't work, because Saginaw Chippewa says there's an issue of sovereignty in the legal language in the contract that you're expecting us to sign, we've got to go back to the drawing board. So it's not just a matter of trust and respect being established, but the recognition too that with this kind of research, you've got to be really patient, that there are different timelines that we find with Indigenous communities, but also what our priorities are in terms of getting things done may not be the same timeline that they have, because again, they've got other things that may be more pressing rather than involvement with an quote unquote academic project. So.
Do you want to go first? Or? I don't know. Okay. So I'm interested in the accessibility of information taken from like archaeological research, not just back to the community, but to the wider public at large. And I'm just wondering, in terms of like the academic world, I don't want to say like academic snobbery, but like the fact that to get to this information, you either have to be part of an institution, you have to have like a student ID or a professor ID and stuff like that. So it's really difficult for other people to learn about these kinds of things, like the stuff you're working on. And I'm just wondering your opinion on the idea of becoming archaeologists at large, becoming more accepting of like working with the media more, or writing books that maybe aren't really technical and maybe more basic language. And I'm just wondering if you think that's something that's just going to take time, or if it's like it has to be an active push by archaeologists to kind of get that knowledge out there. So, I can explain this stuff to people like my parents and my family without them getting like this glazed look over their eyes. Like I'm just wondering your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, in terms of the second question first, I think all of us as academics need to do a better job at explaining to others, not to talk to each other here, but to talk to others outside the university. This is what we do, and this is the question that we're addressing, and this is how we're doing this in a way that is not watered down, but told in plain language. And this is, something that a lot of universities are now trying to promote with that, describe your thesis in 3 minutes kind of thing. Or, the proverbial elevator explanation of being able to, in a short elevator conversation with someone, clearly tell them what you're up to. And I think as a profession, archaeology has gotten really much better at communicating with the public about what we do and why. We have a lot further to go with this. And that includes not just the Indigenous communities with whom we work, but the public at large, because the public is what really funds most research. And if you can get them fired up about why they should care at all about some old 10,000-year-old site with just bones and broken stone on it, if you can tell them what that means and why it's important, why it should be preserved, or the kind of knowledge that can come out of that, they get a better sense of what heritage is all about. And maybe they can start relating their own more distant heritage wherever in the world it is, and come to a better understanding. So as educators, as archaeologists, we've got a commitment there. And the first question, which I've now mostly forgotten, but about taking care of the intellectual property of the knowledge that we're dealing with?
Yeah, like I don't mean like talking about the things that some Indigenous people want to keep quiet. Like I'm not talking about sharing all knowledge. I just mean like basically you answered my question already. So that was my major question. I don't know if I had a two-parter. So yeah, I think you got it anyway. So
yeah, and I would just add that many Indigenous peoples want to share their culture, want to share their knowledge, but not all of it, because there's some things that simply aren't meant to be shared. They may be knowledge that is limited to certain clans or certain groups of initiated people, or to men or to women or whatever. But we have similar controls over knowledge and limits on knowledge in our own society, in terms of the secret formula for Coca-Cola, for example. Why or many other things like that. So, or in terms of archaeology, we do not disclose the location of archaeological sites. That is our secret sacred knowledge, because if we have that as commonly or publicly available knowledge, some people with not the best of intentions will know where to go to that site and dig up artifacts. So.
Well, that was actually a perfect lead into my next question, because this is really fascinating research, and like you said, I think it's becoming easier to do in academia, but right now, the majority of graduates in archaeology, for instance, but I think in a lot of other places, don't end up in academia. And how do you see this sort of initiative, this sort of decolonizing of archaeology playing out in the real world, if you will, where the majority of Indigenous people won't be relating with academic archaeologists, they'll be relating with cultural resource management archaeologists who are hired by corporations, essentially. So how do you see that relationship playing out?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, although it's on the title, I mean, the one word I haven't used so far is decolonizing or decolonization. I think I've been decolonized in a way through becoming self-aware, of being instructed, of being aware that there has been this power imbalance within archaeology in terms of who controls, who benefits from the knowledge of the past that we as archaeologists or as knowledge holders share with us, or we ascertain in some other way. And I think the first step towards decolonization is, of course, acknowledging that there is this imbalance, that there are inequities. And once you do that, you can then make personal decisions in terms of how you approach that, or you may simply choose to avoid it. You're right, too, in that most students in our program don't go on to academia, don't go on to become teachers. And this is probably comparable in many other disciplines, at many other departments here, that whatever you're set out to do, you're getting a degree in geography, chances are you're not going to become a geographer. You're not going to be teaching geography. In archaeology, right now, probably more than 90% of all archaeologists worldwide are involved in cultural resource management. And this is where you take archaeology, which is essentially the discovery of the past, and in all the methods that we have for dating and describing and understanding how things were made and so on. This is the intersection of archaeology with heritage. And what heritage is are the values that contemporary peoples put on all of that old stuff. And it's not always old stuff, too. In Japan, there's a tradition of acknowledging living cultural treasures, of individuals who possess this knowledge that is just so vital to the preservation of heritage. So because of this intersection, I think that all of our students, and I think all archaeologists, stand to benefit from understanding not only the processes of how archaeology works and how we can do it better, but to also understand that archaeology has consequences as much as archaeology has benefits. And where we share that information, where we make it understandable, that is to benefit everyone. But also when we take the time to listen, we could then determine that there's a disconnect between what we as archaeologists are saying about why this is important because of its scientific value, and the community members saying, well, this is important not because of the scientific value, but because our ancestors reside in this place right now. Not long ago, they're there right now, and that's why we do not want this place developed. Because it's not just the loss of artifacts, it's an intersection with our living worldview. And it's a whole different set of challenges. None of this is easy. And in a sense, archaeology has lost its innocence of simply going out and doing archaeology because it's fun, which it really is. But we need to be aware that there's this whole other dimension to it.
Our time is up. Professor Nicholas, would you be willing to answer maybe another question?
Yeah, if there's.
Before I joined the man, as I like to call it, in administration, I was a teacher and professor previously, and my area of expertise was First Nation studies. And when I started in that area, there were very few other First Nations academics and teachers in that field. In fact, I was so disturbed by that situation, I wrote an academic paper that got published. And one of the lines in the paper was, "Where are all the brown faces?" And I still run into colleagues years later that still quote me that line because they saw the paper and agreed with it. But how is that situation in archaeology today? Are there more and more First Nations people actually doing their own archaeology in these communities? Kamloops aside, because that's kind of a special case, but how is it going in other places?
Yeah, and that's certainly something that I've witnessed. I've been really privileged in that respect. That when I started with the Kamloops program, I was basically thrown into the lion's den in a sense. I had really no intention of ever working in the same way with Indigenous peoples, because that whole kind of relationship was only then just starting out as a glimmer in the work of some of my now colleagues. But a few years later, once I was fully ingrained in this and very much involved with what becomes one of the first Indigenous archaeology programs around, I got the notion of, I became aware that there are more and more Indigenous peoples getting involved with archaeology, and that led me to put together this volume, Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeologists, which John mentioned in his introduction. And when I first started that project, I was reaching out to some of the people I knew personally, or those that were recommended to me by some of my colleagues. But it was a real challenge to come up with 30 or so. And there's actually a lot larger number, but some of them simply could not do it. But by the time I finished and published that book in 2010, it came to the point where I could, at that point, do another 10 volumes. It's been a real exponential growth in Indigenous peoples, either at the professional or lay level, getting involved in archaeology. And one of my PhD students, who's First Nations, is a senior archaeologist at Golder Associates in British Columbia. Others are working within the CRM, Cultural Resource Management industry, both part-time and full-time. And we also have a growing number of Indigenous persons becoming scholars. And here at SFU, I've got some great colleagues with Eldon Yellowhorn and Rudy Reimer, both archaeologists, teaching archaeology. So, we're starting to complete this cycle and see this continued growth, and where it ends up, I don't know. Indigenous archaeology is developing into this really rich, really exciting, sometimes problematic realm that on the one hand is unfolding separate from mainstream archaeology, which on the one hand is good because it provides a safe space. But on the other hand, I'd also like to see it incorporated into mainstream archaeology so that people say, gee, that's a really good archaeological and innovative archaeological project, without having to say, by an Indigenous person, so that the work is acknowledged irrespective of race or gender or whatever that qualifier is. And I think when we get to that point, we've seen some real growth.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicholas. Thank you very much, Mr. Bell. And let us thank our speakers today once more.
Thank you.
Our next event is on February 28th, so I hope I'll see you all then. Thank you again. Thank you, Professor Pierce. Thank you.
That was fun.